Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. We are currently on game number 50, so we're getting through them. And we're continuing to look at the games of Jose Raul Capablanca. Capablanca here had the black pieces, and his opponent, the familiar Aron Nimzowitsch, had the white pieces. Now before we start, Reti talks a bit about the Caro-Kann Defence. Now he compares the Caro-Kann initially to the French defence, where with the French defence, after e6, d5 is played. So e6 is played to support d5. In a similar way in the Caro-Kann, c6 is played to support d5. Now, if we compare the Caro-Kann to the French defence, the main disadvantage of the Caro-Kann is black will often want to free themselves with c5. Now in the French defence, this c5 push can be made straight away, so black is wasting no time in trying to free themselves with the c5 push. It doesn't have to be made straight away, it usually is, but it can be made in one move. Whereas in the Caro-Kann, we've already played c6 and now we're going to have to play c5 if we want to do it. So it's going to take two moves to get there. However, in this position, the light square bishop is completely free. It can develop outside of the pawn chain. Whereas in the French defence, it can't develop outside the pawn chain. And so in the French defence, this bishop is the source of a lot of issues for black, whereas in the Caro-Kann, it's not. Now, Reti comments that at the time of playing the Caro-Kann, at the time of writing the book, the principles of Steinitz held a lot more significance than a simple tempo. And because of that, Reti comments that Capablanca actually considered the Caro-Kann to be better than the French defence and felt it was one of the best defences against e4. And the Caro-Kann does still hold up today. Now after c6 and d5, white has three choices, similar to the French defence. White can defend this pawn with something like knight to c3. White can exchange, or white can push the pawn. Now in the game we will see that Nimzowitsch pushes the pawn. Now Reti is a bit critical of pushing the pawn because he says that although black's position is a bit more restricted, because black's able to develop this light square bishop, the restriction doesn't really achieve much when you compare it to, say, the French defence. And so initially he looks at a brief variation that continues after exchanging pawns here. And the next move is bishop to d3. And Reti comments that white needs to make this move, this developing move first, because he wants to stop black from playing bishop f5. Because if white were to play knight f3, bishop f5 now, bishop d3 is still playable, except this exchange would only really benefit black, because black's pawns are on, black's centre pawn is on the light square, and white's centre pawn is on a dark square, so it's black's bad bishop being exchanged for white's good bishop. So Reti comments that bishop to d3 straight away is the best move, preventing any bishop f5 ideas. Knight c6 is usually the follow-up which Reti gives. c3, and now knight f6. And Reti comments that black is aiming to play bishop to g4, hoping to play bishop to g4 before they push e6, obviously. Now he says that white can try h3, aiming to try and stop this development of the light square bishop, but he says that it is a slow move, and he says that actually in this position black can just straight away push e5 because black's ahead in development, and so black wants to open up the position, and they don't mind having a isolated queen pawn because they have the lead in development and more activity. So h3 can be played, but the main move is bishop to f4, and then bishop to g4 just as planned. Queen to b3 is the variation given by Reti. Queen to c8 to defend the pawn. Knight to d2. e6, finishing the pawn chain. Now the bishop's outside the pawn chain. Knight f3. Bishop e7. Castles, castles. Now obviously this was all quite... both sides were able to develop all of their pieces without any issue, so you may not always get this position. But he says that although the moves may not be the same, the ideas and where to put your pieces is often very similar. And he comments that in this position the main imbalance is the open files. White's got the semi-open E file, black has the semi-open C file. So naturally black will want to try and put their rooks on a C file, and white would want to put their rooks on the E file. He also says that black may want to try and put a knight on E5, whilst white might want to try and put a knight on... Sorry, black wants to put a knight on E4, whilst white wants to put a knight on E5. Or alternatively, he says that black may want to try and play knight a5 to knight c4, hoping to place their knight here, because they want to try and provoke this b3 pawn push, because then it will create a permanent pawn weakness by white. Another potential plan by black is to try and push b4, b5, and potentially support the pawn with a5 as well. Because after the pawn exchanges, one side is going to be left with weaknesses, and usually that will be white who is left with weaknesses, although black can backfire against black occasionally. Now he also says that similar to this it's b5 b4 pawn push, white can try something similar by trying to push f4 f5 and potentially support it with g4. However, this obviously runs the risk of weakening the white king. And this is a typical Carlsbad pawn structure. Now this position can also arise from d4, d5 openings, rising from the knight c3, arising from the basic Queen's Gambit declined structure. e6 and e3, and this is a fairly similar position to the one we've just looked at. Fairly similar pawn structure. It's in reverse. White has the open C file here, whilst black has the semi-open E file. So it's a similar sort of position, just in reverse. So that's the potential plans if white were to exchange the pawns in the center. So if white were to take on d5 and then play bishop d3. Now in the game, Nimzowitsch chose to push e5, going into the advanced variation. So black naturally plays bishop f5, getting the bishop outside of the pawn chain, aiming to push e6. And now Nimzowitsch plays bishop to d3. Now Reti comments that even though white has more space, and black will still be exchanging their bad bishop for white's good bishop. And Reti commented that he believes that black probably has the advantage here, since white's pawns may potentially become weak and black may be able to break through. However, this variation is still playable today, and I think the advanced Caro-Kann is one of the most dangerous weapons against the Caro-Kann. Now Reti comments that instead of bishop to d3, a move that has been tried is g4. And the idea is that after bishop to g6, white can try and push e6, sacrificing a pawn but trying to create a weakness in black's position, especially this weak f7 square. Obviously taking would create a clear weakness for black. However, he says that instead of retreating to g6, black can simply retreat back to d7, and yes, black will potentially have to push e6, and this bishop will be inside the pawn chain, but black can argue that this pawn is a weakness, and they can try and exploit this weakness. But naturally, bishop d3 is clearly the more solid and natural move to make. So takes, and now e6 is played. E6 is necessary really, because after something like knight to d7, if white plays e6, then again this will create the same weaknesses we just discussed, and you don't particularly want to allow white to capture here either. So e6 is played. Then we have knight to c3 by Nimzowitsch, queen b6, knight to e2, c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, castles, and knight to e7. Now, Reti comments that a disadvantage that white has is this dark square bishop. The dark square bishop is blocked by the pawn on e5, and very often white will have to push f4 to defend this pawn, which will just block in this bishop even more. And additionally, especially after a move like f4, black may have potential outposts on f5 or even c4, trying to provoke this weakening b3 move. And the reason b3 is a weakness is after, let's say, knight c6, knight a5, and c4, and then b3. The reason it's a weakness is because this pawn is then going to be very weak. It's going to be very hard for white to try and defend this pawn. And likewise, after f5, if white were to play g4, this would clearly be a weakening of the king. So, because of this, black isn't really afraid of a move like knight to a4 attacking the queen and bishop, because in this position where there's this many outposts, black is able to argue that actually the knight is stronger than the bishop. It's not like black is giving up a bishop pair. There's a lot of outposts, so black can make the argument that the knight is stronger than the bishop. And in the game, Nimzowitsch plays knight to a4. You see queen to c6. You see queen to c6. Knight takes, queen takes. So going for that exchange. And now we see bishop to e3. Queen to c7. f4, defending the pawn. Knight to f5. c3. Knight to c6. Rook a to d1, and now g6. And here Reti comments that Capablanca's playstyle is often one where he's very content to just gain a small advantage. the advantages he gains, many stronger players, many masters, will often not really be that satisfied with them. They'd want to try and push for even more advantages. They want to try and push for bigger advantages. Whereas Capablanca is often happy to just have a small advantage, and then him converting the game is simply a matter of technique, of which Capablanca has a lot of. However, Reti does comment that because Capablanca is often happy with smaller advantages, he has drawn a few games where he may well have had the potential to win. And Reti comments that Capablanca is also happy to exchange one advantage for another, rather than trying to hold on to the advantage he does have. And because of this, a lot of players may have played h5, aiming to try and stop g4. However, Capablanca is happy to allow g4. He knows that g4 is a weakening move, and so he might have to exchange the knight for white's bad bishop, but this g4 pawn will be a permanent weakness, so he will almost be exchanging the strong knight on the outpost of f5 for the weakening in white's position. And that's what happens in the game. Nimzowitsch plays g4. You see knight takes e3, queen takes e3, and now h5. And Reti comments that this is why black allows g4. So white has to play g5 themselves here, because otherwise if they take, they're going to have a permanent weakness on h2. And likewise, if they try and defend, then they're going to end up with black's going to have this very nice open H file here, and white will still have potential weaknesses on the king side with their pawns. So white really has to push g5 to try and close off the position around their king and prevent there being too many weaknesses. However, this move will give black the f5 square. And the other disadvantage in white's position is although this move gives black the f5 square, there's also the e4 square and the c4 square. There's a lot of weak squares in white's position. The g4 square as well, potentially, although h3 is an option. So here Capablanca castles. We see knight to d4, queen to b6, pinning the knight to the queen, and the queen to the king, incidentally. We see rook f2, defending the pawn, rook a to c8, and now a3. And Reti comments that this does weaken white's position more. However, he says that white would perhaps struggle to play without this move, even though it is a weakening move still, because this a pawn will be otherwise undefended, and it may cause a bit of grief for white in the future. There may be some potential combinations and tactics that will be present because of an undefended pawn on a2. We see rook to c7 by Capablanca, aiming to potentially double up. Rook to d3, knight to a5, rook to e2, and now Capablanca plays rook to e8. And the reason he plays rook e8 is so he wastes a move. After f5, white will have a little bit of counterplay, because after something like e takes f5, e6 can come, and white's potentially able to try and break through and get quite a bit more activity. So Capablanca plays rook to e8 to just keep an eye on this e file, which might potentially open. We see king to g2, and at this point Capablanca's now found the plan. He knows what he wants to do. So he's not really in any rush to play knight to c4, because actually what he wants to do is try and get his rook to c4, because on c4 it can also control the e4 outpost and exert pressure on the f4 pawn. So actually a rook on c4 will have a lot more control over this file than a knight on c4 would, especially if you can get a rook on e4 and a rook on c4. He can double up his rooks here, then those rooks will be so much more powerful than a knight on c4. So that's his plan. And to do that, he just needs to try and remove white's knight. So that's sort of the next, what he's going to try and do over the next however many moves. So he plays knight to c6, rook e to d2, rook to c8, and now rook to e2, knight to e7, and we can see how white is just sort of stuck. White hasn't really got any way to improve their position without creating more and more weaknesses in their position. So white's essentially just stuck moving backwards and forwards. We now see rook to c4 and queen to h3. So white's trying to prevent knight f5 from happening, because if it happens straight away, knight takes f5. If e takes f5, then queen f3. This doesn't actually hang the pawn because the rook can take here. So queen to f3 would defend this pawn and add another attacker onto the d5 pawn. If g takes f5, then clearly queen takes h5 not only wins a pawn, but gives white a huge amount of activity and potential with this open h file, and the rook's ready to swing over as well. So white played queen to h3 to try and prevent knight f5. We see king to g7, rook f2, a5, and now Reti comes up black with this a5 move is hoping to try and push a5, a4, and then play knight c6 to knight a5 to knight b3 in order to try and remove this knight from d4. Because Capablanca wants to keep his queen quite active along this diagonal, and he wants to exchange the knights ideally. But he also wants the queen to continue attacking b2, his weak pawn here, because it's sort of tying all of white's pieces down to the defense of everything. White here plays rook to e2, and Reti comments that black was originally obviously planning to play a4, knight c6, knight a5, knight b3 to try and take this knight on d4. And that's what he would have done if white had played rook f to d2 instead. But instead, with rook e2, black can just straight away play knight f5. And the reason this doesn't work after rook e to d2, the reason this doesn't work after rook e to d2 is knight takes d4, rook takes d4, c takes d4, followed by queen to b5, and then rook to c8. So that's the threat currently, and that's why white had to play rook to d2 straight away. Now if they had played rook to d2 here instead, knight f5 now doesn't work. This is what white had to do to force black to the a5 and knight to c6, knight to c6, knight to a5, knight to b3 maneuver. Because after here, knight takes a5 is a possibility. Because after g takes f5, queen takes h5, rook h8 can come. And now queen f3, rook h4, and you can see that black's getting a lot of activity along here. Except rook to d4 can now be played. Now obviously, in the game, this rook was on e2. So in that instance, rook to d4 would lose a pawn. Sorry, because there's two attackers. But now, with the rook on d2, it means that black's attack is sort of stopped a little bit. Black's probably still a bit better, it's more playable for black, although the position is very likely equal. So white plays rook to e2 instead, and this allows this knight f5 maneuver. And we see knight takes f5 check, g takes f5, and now obviously if queen takes h5, rook to h8, we'll see that same maneuver, and rook to d4 is no longer available. So because of that, white doesn't take on h5, instead white plays queen to f3, preferring to keep the h file closed. We see king to g6, rook to d2 now, rook to e4, rook to d4, and now rook to c4, x-ray defending each other here. We now have queen to f2, queen to b5, king g6, and now rook takes d4. And after c takes d4, queen to c4, king g2 b5, now in this position white's queen and rook are very much stuck. So they're all stuck to the defense of the f4 pawn and the d4 pawn, but they're also stuck to the defense of the second rank. And this means that Capablanca is able to just essentially finish off the game. And it does it by first pushing the b pawn. So Nimzowitsch plays king to g1, and now b4. A takes b4, a takes b4, king to g2, and now queen to c1. So Capablanca resolved the tension here on the queen side, but also created this isolated pawn, which is going to be a bit of a weakness in the future. And this Reti describes as being one of the first forced moves of the position. So neither the queen or rook can move without losing a pawn, and black can't really push h3 or h4 without weakening the position even more and creating another weakness in their position. Therefore, white has no choice really but to move the king. But now black can get in with queen to h1. We see rook to d3, and still white can't really exchange either the queen or rook without losing something due to the amount of weaknesses they have. And now rook to e1. We see rook to f3, and now rook to d1. It's another forced move since the queen can't really move without dropping the pawn. And now b3. Already gives a little variation. After something like king h3, rook to d2 is actually an option, because the queen can't take because of queen takes f3 check, which would result in checkmate. So b3 is played, because it's essentially the only move that white really has. The other variation which Reti gives is rook to b3. Except after rook f1, white's now lost. If they play, say, to move the queen out the way, well, now rook to f3 check can come, because after rook takes f3 h4, we're now looking at mate again. So b3 is played, and now rook to b1, rook to e3, and now rook to f1. And here white resigned, because if white was to try and move the queen out the way, then queen g1 check can come, and this is just going to lead to mate. the queen blocks, you can take the rook. If the king moves, then you've got checkmate. And so that was game number 50. And I really quite like Capablanca's games. He's one of my favourite grandmasters, actually. I don't think he had a title grandmaster. He was one of my favourite masters. This game seems quite characteristic of his gameplay, where he has this small advantage, and he just seems to just maneuver around his opponent almost perfectly, and just tie up all of his opponent's pieces so wow, and then just crushes his opponent straight after. It's a really nice playstyle. It's almost like quite delicate playstyle, I imagine. But yeah, so that's game number 50. I think we've got a couple more games of Capablanca as well. So if you liked it, please do like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.